Good morning, everybody. It's Dr. Karen. So this morning I wanted to talk a little bit about social pragmatic intervention based on some of the questions that I've gotten the last couple months or so about interventions for people on the spectrum and people who have other social pragmatic issues as a result of any type of disability that impacts social cognition. So to start off, obviously working with these populations sometimes seems like an uphill battle for some of us. Sometimes we are working on the same things over and over again, and it seems like some of those students don't make progress no matter how many times we've explained social rules to them, or there might be those kids who don't behave appropriately no matter how many times you've tried behavior charts and things like that. And it can be stressful for them, obviously, because they're not quite sure how to navigate those social situations. They're not really sure why people are responding the way that they are to those particular, to the way that they're acting or things that they're saying. And on our end, we sometimes worry and we kind of wonder, all right, what's going to happen to them if they're a child now, but they're going to be an adult eventually. They're going to grow up, and what's their life going to be like if they're not able to relate to other people? Are they going to have a good life? Are they going to be able to have some of those things that we consider to be part of a good life? So things like having friends, having a significant other, being able to have a conversation with somebody and connect with them, or even just right now being able to get through the school day without being reprimanded for something because they didn't quite understand the expectations of the situation. And then eventually, obviously, we want them to succeed at those things now so that they can eventually hold down a steady job and be a productive member of society. So we want to figure out how to intervene in a way that empowers them, but also can get to the root of why that they're struggling in the first place. But the problem is that a lot of times we feel like our social skills interventions are not getting anywhere. And then we worry that, we don't know what we're doing or that we're not effective, and we don't want to set our clients up for failure. So the good part, or the good news for you, is that if you have experienced any of those things where you feel like just something is not connecting for them, you're just not making that progress, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that, let me start with the bad news first. The bad news obviously is that if you keep doing what you've been doing, you're going to keep getting what you've always gotten. But the good news is that the problem is actually easier to fix than you think. It's not that you're not effective, it's just that you haven't found the right set of strategies. So it's not about finding the right set of materials or finding the right worksheets or downloads or flashcards or whatever. The real problem is that you haven't included work on the 3 essential components in your intervention. And so once you incorporate these things, that's when you finally will able to help your students to relate to other people in a more functional way, in an authentic way. You'll see that they start to increase their motivation. So they might actually care what you're working on with them rather than just kind of doing it to appease you, or maybe not doing it all because they don't want to do it. You'll realize that the challenges that your students are facing, they're not all-time absolute roadblocks. They're more like bumps in the road that you're going to be able to work through and teach them strategies to work through. And you'll find that they have the capacity to adapt to social situations in a way that you might not have imagined that they're able to do. And then most importantly, you'll finally, for you, it'll be exciting because you're going to see them make progress and so you're going to start to feel that excitement that you did when you decided to do this type of intervention in the first place, when you decided that you wanted to be a clinician to support this particular population. So let's get into those 3 components. Now, these 3 components are what helps individuals with autism spectrum disorder and other related disorders that impact social cognition. It helps them to develop the social functioning skills they need in order to live happy, healthy, functional, and productive lives. So I want to share them with you, and then we'll also get into the top mistakes that practitioners are making when it comes to social skills training, the most common misconceptions about people with autism spectrum disorder and related disorder, and why it's just completely just a bunch of BS. And I'll also share why these essential components are so critical for generalizing when it comes to those pragmatic language skills, which we all know is a big issue. And then I'll share some of my aha moments that I use to help some of my students go from things like, kind of being isolated, spending lunch alone, spending recess alone, to actually developing thriving friendships. So let's first talk about why we treat pragmatic language in therapy in the first place. I've actually had colleagues that were not SLPs who said, well, I work on social skills in my groups. Why do you need to be working on this too? What do you have to do with it as a speech pathologist? Well, I imagine that you've probably got a pretty good idea of why you're working on it and why social cognition is important if you're listening to me right now. But I'm going to share some stats with you so that you can share this with your colleagues if you need some additional leverage and if some other people are questioning why you're working on it. So obviously, social and pragmatic language skills are massively valuable when it comes to our success. However, they're consistently misunderstood. And so it's easy for social skills challenges to be mistaken for things like apathy or lack of effort or even defiance. So this could include things like people who struggle to make eye contact or just don't, for whatever reason, they're not making eye contact and they're not doing it in a way that helps them communicate effectively. They maybe don't appropriately initiate conversations. They might have difficulty maintaining conversations and relationships. They might speak out of turn or perseverate on topics or maybe misinterpret social cues. So obviously the list can go on, but the point is that it's not easy to teach some of these skills that come so naturally to us. And we often associate a lot of these symptoms with high-functioning autism, but there are a number of other different conditions that can impact social functioning. But either way, the number of individuals who struggle with these skills is increasing. So when we actually look at some data, some statistics, according to the 2018 CDC Autism Incident Rate Statement from the Autism Society, up to 1 out of 58 8-year-olds has autism. So it is going up. And then when we looked at the data from the years of 2014 to 2016, the prevalence of children who were ever diagnosed with any developmental disability increased. So it went from 5.6% in 2014 to 6.99% in 2016. So it is going up. So that means that there's an increasing number of individuals who have conditions that impact things like control and regulation, focus, attention and transitions, organization, memory, time management, emotional control and frustration, and social functioning. Obviously, all of those things I mentioned before also impact social functioning. And then, of course, there's learning and cognition, which we know that people who struggle with learning and cognition are more likely to have issues with social functioning as a whole. So it is a problem. It is increasing. We do need to be prepared to deal with or help the individuals who are struggling through these things so that they can function more effectively. But fortunately, there's good news, and that's that with the right intervention and support, individuals with pragmatic language difficulties can actually lead very functional lives. Some examples of people who have managed to leverage, again, the way that they think is very unique. The way that they process things is very unique, and it's kind of, for a lot of people, they're able to leverage it as a strength in some situations just because they see the world differently. But then in other situations, it can cause them difficulties because they're not able to understand the expectations of those situations and function the same way that other people are able to. So it does cause them some problems and they do need some help. However, we see some people who have managed to have very successful lives, people like Dan Aykroyd, who has found ways to use his unique way of seeing the world to have a very successful career as a comedian and an actor. Or people like Temple Grandin, who has really shown what is possible with a lot of hard work and dedication. And again, just the way that she thinks about things is different. So sometimes she's able to come up with ideas that we might not see or that might not be apparent to us. So she's managed to leverage that and learn how to function and develop strategies. And then there's even John Elder Robison, who I talk about a lot. I'm a big fan of his work, but again, he's a best-selling author who's educated thousands of people on what it's like to grow up with an Asperger's diagnosis. And again, he's had some struggles through his life, but also he's managed to keep the parts of him that are his strengths related to his diagnosis, but then also to work with those other things that might have caused him some issues in certain situations. So those are the famous people. There's also students like, there was my student Brian. Again, I'm giving him a fake name so that I preserve his confidentiality, but I actually had a student who, he started out in preschool barely talking, and now he's actually able to attend most of his high school classes in general education with a special ed co-teacher. And he's actually one of the students who, when I was still in the schools a couple years ago, when I would see him walking down the hallway in the high school, he's one of my only students that he, and again, I do see a lot of my former students in the high school that I had in elementary school who may or may not still be getting services, but he would be, again, polite, initiate conversation, totally appropriate. And he's one of the only students that did that. And he has just really come out of his shell. And so he's doing things that his parents just never thought he'd be able to do. And they're just blown away at what he's doing. And so who knows what's in store for him for the future, because he just keeps surprising us every year. So it is possible to have some success, but let's talk a little bit about why some individuals with autism and other social cognitive challenges end up successful, and how they're able to keep the parts of them that are a strength and leverage them, but then at the same time be able to work with those things that do cause them a disadvantage in some situation. And so just talk about the contrast between people who are able to be successful and then the ones who end up really struggling. For example, I know I have when I was teaching an autism course for university, I had a student whose friend had a son who was on the spectrum, and she couldn't get him to leave the house. And he wasn't able to go to the grocery store. He wasn't able to have a job. He didn't have friends and relationships. He just stayed in the basement on his computer all day. And so he wasn't able to be a productive member of society at that point. And let's talk a little bit about why there's such a contrast there with certain people. So what we've got to do is ultimately, this is in order to help our students be in that successful group, we've got to shift our intervention focus. So it's not about the things that honestly I do get questions about. It's not about the materials that you have or even having the perfect techniques. I mean, yes, you need techniques. You need to know what to do. But it's not having the perfect techniques don't matter, or having techniques that are evidence-based don't matter if you don't have the right framework to structure them and guide them so that you know what materials and techniques to pick. And it's also not about the data collection either. We get really worried about this because we're worried that the IEP police are going to get us or whatever. And yes, we do need to take data. We do need to do our paperwork and stay legally compliant. But I think that we get a little bit data obsessed. Sometimes it's because we feel like we have to for our jobs. We're worried. But sometimes I think we just kind of have a hard time seeing the forest for the trees and seeing the big picture. We've got to be able to see the big picture if we're going to be able to figure out how to pick out the materials, the techniques, and know what to take data on. So here are some of the most common questions I get about autism and pragmatic language. So I get questions about, how do I take data for pragmatic goals? How do I get kids to make eye contact or take turns or play with other kids or act, quote, appropriately? What strategies and behavior systems will keep my students motivated? What strategies are evidence-based practice for pragmatic language? Or even, where can I get good materials like videos, worksheets, flashcards, etc.? So I'm going to tell you that yes, we need to do all of those things, but if you want to truly help your students be successful, they're actually the wrong questions to be asking at this point. Yes, we have to do all of those things, but if we don't answer a couple other questions first, you're never going to be able to figure out how to answer those questions that are kind of very specific tactical questions. But again, if we don't understand the framework for what we're doing and the point of what we're doing and why our students are acting the way that they are, we're going to have a hard time doing any of those things effectively. So again, chances are you're probably getting a lot of pressure from other people in the field, your boss, whatever, about data, evidence-based practice, all of those things. But in the grand scheme of things, these are really just minor details. And if you get the big picture of how to address social skills the right way, many of them will just fall into place for you, and it'll become apparent how you're supposed to do those things. So they'll be much easier to tackle. And what's interesting is that picking the best technique doesn't matter as much as you think. Because if you had the right focus for your therapy, there might be a couple options that could work for you. And again, picking the right technique at the wrong time is actually the wrong technique. So let's get into those 3 essential components for social pragmatic intervention. When it comes to social skills intervention, a lot of those tactical questions I mentioned have to do with the how of pragmatic intervention. So this includes things like planning therapy, deciding what activities and materials to use, figuring out how to track progress, things like that. And those things are all important, but unfortunately you can't get to the how if you don't know the why and the what, which is why we're talking about the 3 components. So let's talk about what they are. So what you need is that there are 3 things that you want to have in order to make sure that you're guiding yourself effectively when it comes to therapy. Number 1, we need a roadmap. Number 2, we need to have explicit teaching of skills. So the roadmap informs what skills you need to target based on what areas your students are struggling. And then once we figure that out, we want to have strategies that will allow our students, or allow us to explicitly teach those skills or strategies to our students. And then number 3, the 3rd essential component, is practice. So we need to, once we explicitly teach, we need to make sure that our therapy framework enables our students to get adequate practice in the right settings with the right skills. So those 3 essential components are your roadmap, explicit teaching, and practice. And what that should equate to is effective social functioning. So all those things are going to guide you to actually get your students to function socially. All right. So before we actually talk about how to apply those components, let's put one of those BS myths to rest when it comes to people with autism. And that is things like, he just isn't interested in having friends. He's just a loner. He's just really antisocial. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say this. And I've even heard this from students themselves, but I think it was more out of frustration and a desire to avoid failure than actually not wanting friends. Because typically people who are struggling with social skills want friends. They just don't know how to have them and maintain those relationships effectively. And so that's why it's our job to help them do that and understand why they're not able to do that, so that we can teach them how. But in order to do that effectively, we can't just come in and just explain the rules to them, because a lot of times it's almost like we're forcing them to fit into this mold that just doesn't work for them. So in order to help them to maintain those relationships effectively, we need to understand why they're not doing the behaviors required to build social relationships. What we often do with our students is that we skip straight to explaining how, like, how do you start a conversation? Look at somebody, all of these things, or like we start skipping straight to the behaviors that they need to do without making those connections for our students with the reasoning behind those behaviors. And if that doesn't make sense to them, again, if they understood why they needed to do those behaviors, they would be doing them. So you simply telling them, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this, well, that's not going to work, because they might be able to do it in the short term when you're sitting there on top of them in your role play situation or whatever, or they might be able to spit out the answer that you want them to when you've got your flashcards out, or when you're looking at your picture scenes in therapy or whatever, but they're not going to actually be able to use it in the situation where they need to if they don't understand why, and they don't understand the connection to how it's related to where they're struggling. So let's dive a little bit into all those components. So again, the three components are roadmap, explicit teaching, and practice. So talking about the roadmap, one reason that individuals may struggle with social skills is that they haven't picked up on the social rules, which is often referred to as the hidden curriculum. So you'd think that someone with social skills plus a background in communication disorders like us would implicitly know what skills to teach them, right? Well, that's actually wrong. Because socialization comes so naturally to us, it's actually so easy for us, we don't even think about it, because it's so obvious to us that we just do it automatically. We're not very meta about it, we just do it. So we've gotten so good at it that we don't know what it's like to think explicitly about those skills. And a lot of times things are so obvious to us, it doesn't occur to us that we might need to explain them. And sometimes we're so good that we can't explain it. We can't always explain why we do what we do. And that happens a lot. When you don't remember or don't know what it's like to struggle with something, you don't necessarily know when and why and how to explain it. So it's easy to sit in front of our computer trying to write our goals and then come up with kind of vague goals that we have no idea to measure. And that's why sometimes we see kind of vague goals like student will improve social skills with 80% accuracy or something like that. And again, it's because a lot of times we're like, okay, what is it really that they're not doing? Like, it's just hard to get into their head. So we've got to be able to break the impairments down to be able to figure out how are we going to address those and how are we going to reframe that into something positive. So that brings us to the 6 categories of social impairment that can actually start to build this roadmap for you. And the reason you need this roadmap is, again, you're so good at social skills, they're so obvious to you that you might not think that they're a deficit, or you might not realize that your student's struggling with them, because we almost don't even realize that it's a skill. It's just like we just do it. So the 6 categories of social impairment are, again, nonverbal communication, social initiation. So again, nonverbal like body language and things like that, eye contact, social initiation. So knowing how to start a conversation and get somebody's attention, reciprocity or terminating interactions. So again, we've got to start the interaction, then we've got to maintain it, and then we've got to end it. So those are actually separate skills. A lot of times we just have conversation as one big skill, but it's not. It's separate skills. Then there's social cognition. Again, the actual knowledge of social skills and knowing what we should actually do, and just awareness of what those social behaviors are. So having the actual cognitive knowledge of those skills. Then we've got self-awareness, perspective taking. So again, awareness of yourself, and then how that yourself how that interacts with other people and their perspective. And then finally, we've got social anxiety and withdrawal, which happens a lot. And that a lot of times is why we get that apathy and that appearance of not wanting something when really it's just avoidance of something that's a painful situation for them. So let me repeat those 6 areas again. Again, I can post some information below this video as well. So we've got nonverbal, social initiation, reciprocity and terminating interactions, social cognition, self-awareness and perspective taking, and social anxiety and withdrawal. Those are your 6 areas. So that's the area of your roadmap that can start to give you a framework for being able to problem solve what your student is actually struggling with. And this is where we start. This is what actually guides the techniques that we pick and how we monitor it. All right, so that's component number 1, your roadmap, which you form by understanding those 6 areas of social impairment. Let's move on to component number 2, which is explicit teaching. So in John Elder Robison's book, Be Different, he shares the challenges he faced going through school with Asperger's and how grateful he was to actually have a diagnosis, because he saw that it was kind of an explanation, or again, a roadmap for why he was the way he was, because that made it more clear to him what he needed to work on. It was like, okay, there is a framework for understanding why I think about things the way that I do and what interventions might be helpful for me. So it wasn't really about having a stigma or negative labeling. It was more about a guide to figure out what's going to help me. And the thing is that a lot of individuals are left to figure out that hidden curriculum I talked about before on their own. So there's a curriculum for how we engage in social situations. And because people with social cognitive challenges don't, again, the curriculum is hidden. It's obvious to us. It's not obvious to them. And so what we learn implicitly, they need to learn explicitly. So that's the rationale behind the second component, which is explicit teaching. We just learn it from being in social situations. And what we do is we think, let's just put him in this situation. He'll just figure out these skills. But the problem is that they don't. They actually need someone to be more direct with them, because if they were going to figure it out from being in those situations, they would have figured it out by now. So we know that there are those 6 areas of impairment, and we know that these individuals require explicit instruction. And what we want to do is recognize that if we want these individuals to have effective social skills, we need to teach them effective social skills, meaning we've got to directly explain them. And they just can't be put in an environment where they can observe others acting appropriately, because they're not understanding the rationale behind why, and sometimes they might have not even be paying attention to them. The interesting thing is that because of this, it's actually more important for you to be direct with your clients and to have an understanding of the area of social impairment rather than finding that perfect material or that strategy. And actually what that does is, if you're able to actually demonstrate to them that you understand why they're struggling, that's going to establish that rapport. And what that does is, if you have that relationship, that can actually have a bigger impact than the actual technique that you pick. So there was a study done back in 1999. And again, there have been some replications, but I share this one because it was kind of a seminal work. And what's really fascinating is that they showed that it wasn't necessarily the treatment technique and the tactical things. It was more about the overall focus and framework of therapy that actually impacted the patient outcomes. So here are the percentages. So when they broke down the factors responsible for treatment effectiveness for individuals getting language interventions, extra therapeutic and client factors accounted for 40% of the outcomes. So that was things like, again, environment, client factors like their attitude, things like that. their level of comfort with the therapist, all of those things. And just, again, their attitude about coming to therapy. All of those things are client factors that impact. And again, 40%, that's almost half. Then the next was the therapeutic relationship, which accounted for 30%. So again, that rapport, demonstrating that you understand, that you care about them. So right now we're at 70%. So this is why things like we say bedside manner or even placebo effect and things like that, this is why those things are so powerful, because again, things like those client factors in that relationship together account for 70% of your treatment outcomes. The next is hope and expectation. So again, their attitude about whether or not it was going to work. And then, so that was 15%. So now we're at 85%. So again, extra therapeutic and client factors are 40%, therapeutic relationship 30%, hope and expectation 15%. And then technique was 15%. So we spend all this time obsessing about evidence-based practices and techniques. And in this study, they found that it only accounted for 15% of the treatment effectiveness. Now, this doesn't mean that you should ditch evidence-based practice and not have effective techniques. Part of it is that, again, if you pick the right technique, a lot of times, again, if you pick the right technique, sometimes it's like, you know, your patients might experience some success with it. That's going to improve their attitude. That's going to build your relationship. So it can impact those other things. So again, we've got to have the right technique, but sometimes just picking the technique that seems to be a little more, again, if you pick the right thing, what that's going to do is, again, you're going to be demonstrating to them that clear alignment with, all right, I get where you're struggling, and this is why this technique is going to help. And so when you can draw that parallel for them, again, by picking the right technique, that's going to help building those other things. But the thing is that if we don't sit down and build that relationship and actually, again, demonstrate that respect for them by directly teaching some of those things that they might be struggling with, then it doesn't matter what technique we pick. So the thing is that we've got to account for all of those factors. And that's why it's so important for us to have that overall focus that demonstrates that we're actually getting and demonstrates to them that we actually understand where they're struggling. So that's why, again, component number one, diagnosing that effective, identifying that area of struggle for them. Again, understanding those 6 categories of social impairment, and then taking it to that next step of explicit teaching. What those are going to help do is actually build all 4 of those things and help you do all of them effectively, because they are all important. They all account for some difference. But again, it's not just about technique. It's about all of these things. It's about the big picture. Imagine if you were struggling with something, and then somebody finally sits down with you and says, okay, this is why you're struggling. And having that aha moment and then saying, okay, I'm going to actually sit down and explain it to you. I mean, imagine what that's going to do for that relationship that you have with that person. So again, that's why this can be so effective if we have that good roadmap and that explicit teaching. So number 3, we've got practice. Okay, so again, it's not enough to just have that area diagnosed and that explicit teaching. We've also got to be able to give our students the support and practice in the right settings, because a lot of times they might have the knowledge, they might even have the skill, but they don't know when and why to use it. So that's why we need to understand how to integrate all of those different social skills together. So the thing is that successful social interaction actually depends on integrating 3 different things. It depends on thinking, feeling, and doing. Because what happens is that we do things. So we do an action, and then something happens, and we think about it. That forms our thoughts. And then that means that we have certain feelings about that situation. And then what we're thinking and feeling is going to impact what we're doing. That's why we see a lot of that social anxiety and withdrawal. And what that's also going to do is give that person feedback about how they should act in a certain situation. But if they're always getting negative feedback, they're not always going to necessarily have an accurate representation of that situation. And they're not going to necessarily know what to do in that situation, again, because the feedback is always negative. So what we have to do is a lot of times, again, when we get very narrowly focused on techniques and teaching those behaviors, we're only focused on the doing component and we're completely disregarding the thinking and feeling. This is, again, why demonstrating that empathy in that relationship is so important to us actually aligning that with the right strategies, because if we can't tell our clients what they should be doing if we don't understand what they're thinking and feeling. So again, those three things that you actually need in order to help our students problem solve during those situations where they're going to have to be practicing those behaviors. So those functional situations is, again, thinking, feeling, and doing. So what we want to do is address all of those factors and then find ways for our students to actually practice those behaviors. And then we want to be able to, once they do that, the way that we're actually going to be able to help them through those situations more effectively is that we're going to have to, again, be there to talk them through it so that they can accurately understand and interpret those situations. When you give them the opportunity to practice a social skill, they get some feedback. You want to help them figure out and troubleshoot what they did or didn't do well in that situation or functionally in that situation. And that's why we've got to tie in the thinking or feeling to really help them be effective in those practice situations. So again, how it works is, again, demonstrate that understanding of in component number one, where we develop that roadmap and understand those 6 areas of impairment. And then we figure out where they're struggling, explicitly teach them, and then we form that practice. So that's why those 3 components go together. So that sums up how you want to have your framework when it comes to social pragmatic intervention. Again, the goal is that we want to have those 3 components that are going to really give us a solid intervention plan. If we stick right to, like, let me print out these pre-made social stories or whatever, we're going to miss the mark and we're not going to be sure if those things are necessarily effective. And this is why, again, I knew things like video modeling, social stories, power cards, whatever. I knew those things were effective, but when I tried to do them, if I didn't use this overall framework and demonstrate that understanding of why, I was just kind of like almost forcing these behaviors onto my students without really demonstrating that empathy and understanding, and without really helping them understand why. So what I did was I was kind of just like forcing these behaviors on them without them really making any connections about how those behaviors were relevant. So they would just kind of do it for me in therapy, and then they would go out and do the same thing that they were always doing outside. Again, because I did not have that relationship with them that demonstrated that I got where they were, and tied those connections together for them so that when I actually did come down to picking the strategies and materials, it made sense to them and they bought into it. So the thing is that I was able to, again, I spent quite a bit of time working through this on my own in therapy, and then also mentoring others who were doing this as well. So I finally got to really revise those strategies and really add all 3 of these components so that I was able to finally help my students to work through and create more functional environments for them. So the thing is that it took me a long time, and it was a struggle, and I did see a lot of my students feel frustrating, and you know, you always have those students where you're like, man, they're gone, they're on to another therapist, or they're graduated, and I missed the mark for them. And that sucks when that happens. You don't want to feel like that. So the good news is that you don't have to have years of trial and error like I did. You can actually help your students now so that you don't miss the boat for them and send them on to that next stage of their lives without providing that foundation that they need to be successful. So what I've actually done is I have dove into this framework for you in my course, the Social Language Roadmap, where I dive deep into this framework and I teach you how to diagnose those 6 areas of impairment and then write good therapy goals based on those areas of impairment, and then figure out how to add those elements of thinking, feeling, and doing, and picking the right strategies, and then actually implementing those strategies in a way that incorporates all 3 of these components. So again, that ties your roadmap to the explicit teaching and the practice. So I'll show you how to actually do that and work through some of those logistics and actually implementing it. So that's what I will walk through in the Social Language Roadmap. So I just revised this course. It initially was a 3-hour seminar. I've just recently expanded and added to it. It's still available for the introductory rate, but the tuition is actually going to be doubling later on this fall. But you can actually still get in now because I've just recently upgraded it. So again, I've doubled the course, doubled the value. We are going to be doubling the tuition, but you can actually still get in now in the introductory rate if you sign up within this next month. So to tell you a little bit about what's included in the course, it has 6.5 hours worth of training designed to guide you through those tenets of social skills and a protocol for writing goals and planning intervention for social pragmatic therapy. So how it breaks down is that in section 1 of the program, we talk a little bit more about what it takes to have effective social interventions and what you need to teach your students so that they can have effective social interactions. And then we'll talk a little bit about why a lot of those pre-made materials miss the mark, and go through a lot of the mistakes that practitioners are making when implementing social skills interventions, including some of the myths preventing us from getting results. And then I'll talk a little bit about why having a massive list of strategies is not what you need, and also the big distinction that we need to make, which is why teaching social skills is different from academic skills and how we need to plan our interventions accordingly. And then in section 2, I'll show you the 3 components that we need in order to have social interactions. So we'll talk about the often overlooked skills your students need to read social cues accurately, the impact of social anxiety on social functioning and how to deal with it, and then how to help your students manage those anxiety-inducing triggers so that they can actually be successful in social situations instead of withdrawing. And then finally, actually not finally, in section 3, we'll talk about the steps to efficient and effective social pragmatic planning. So using those 6 categories of social impairment, translating those into tangible goal statements, and then talking about how to target those social language goals, including picking the right intervention. And then section 4, which is brand new, it's the advanced intervention tutorials. This is where I actually walk you through tutorials for the interventions. So creating social scripts and video modeling and narrative language protocols, video modeling narrative protocols. And then the strategy behind good social scripts, how to create those videos, how to motivate students and break down belief patterns that may be holding them back, and how to help students with conditions that impact attention, and like attention deficit, autism spectrum disorder, and then also how to actually use behavior charts effectively to motivate students rather than just kind of shaming them, and rather than the way that behavior charts are often used. So we'll go through all of this in the program. Again, it's designed to give you that roadmap to walk through this essential framework for social pragmatic intervention. So if you're sick of digging through materials that don't work, or stressed about doing evidence-based practice or data collection, if you're tired of targeting things like eye contact when they just don't work, and you're just really sick of seeing your students miss out on genuine social connections, and instead you want to finally unlock your students' capacity to adapt to social situations and help them make lasting friendships and enjoy social interaction so that they can have successful lives, then come join me in the Social Language Roadmap. So I'm going to share links below to the program that's going to walk through all of these resources and these things that I've covered today in high level in detail. So it's going to show you the how-to of all those interventions that you can use to create this framework for your students. So thank you so much for listening today. Please email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com with any questions. Again, the Social Language Roadmap course is, again, we just doubled the value. You can still get in at the introductory rate, and we are going to be increasing that later on this year, but wanted to give you the opportunity to get in before that goes up. So again, you have a choice. You can continue to let your students struggle and have those students who might completely miss the boat. I mean, you could send them on and they're not going to get the help that they need. And then you're going to have that feeling, again, you have that feeling of, am I doing this right? Am I really helping my students? Or instead, you can let me walk you through this so that you can start helping your students this next month rather than waiting years from now to start helping those students or helping students on the spectrum, so that you can have that roadmap so that you can feel like a confident expert who helps students to really change their lives so that they can have functional, productive lives. So thanks so much for listening. I'll share the links to the Social Language Roadmap course so that you can join me today and learn how to guide your students through effective social functioning. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope to see you in the members area.